Okay, so in this lecture, I'm going to cover the second mini project, which is an online game played across two or more computers. And start again. Okay, so in this lecture, I'm going to cover the second mini project, which is an online game played between two or more computers. It's a group project, and you're going to be working on this project throughout the spring term. So I'm going to give you a general sort of overview of the project, talk about the two submissions that you have to make for the project, explain how it's going to be assessed, and give a few little examples just to get you going. Right, so as explained, it's a group project. It's worth 20% of the overall mark for the module. And so I'm going to mark it out of 100 and scale the mark down to a mark between 0 and 20. Now, in both of the submissions, as I will explain, there's a spreadsheet that's used to calculate a person's individual mark from the group mark based upon the contribution that they've made to the project. So although it's a group project, you are being assessed individually on what you've actually contributed to the group. Two deadlines. So first deadline will be the end of week 20, when you have to submit an interim report, and I'll explain what you've got to put in that. And then there's a final submission at the end of week 23, and then there'll be a demonstration in the lab sessions in week 24. So these deadlines, since I'm recording this lecture, right, I might use this lecture for a couple of years, who knows. So I'm only going to put deadlines in terms of weeks in this lecture. If you want the full, accurate, to the minute deadlines, have a look in the project description, which is available on the course website. So Mini Project 2 is an online game that can be played between two or more players on different computers. So it's a little mini version of the sort of massive multiplayer online game that was covered in an earlier lecture. So I'm expecting you to implement all of the relevant aspects of the game functionality. So the players should be able to join the game or join the system. They should be able to find other players. They should be able to play the game, obviously, and they should be able to identify the winner. And most important is this idea of different computers, right? You've got to demonstrate this project on two separate computers. You've got to be able to play the game across two separate computers. It's essentially a networking project, okay? So there's no marks for an implementation of tic-tac-toe, partly because it's kind of easy, but mainly because in previous years, tic-tac-toe has been taught in the second year, so I'm not going to just get you to repeat the same project twice. No marks for artificial intelligence. Sure, you could do some super smart AI or whatever, but I don't want to waste your time on it really. It's just focused on playing games creating a game that can be played between humans. There's no marks for use of standard HTTP methods to implement the core game functionality. So the computers have to talk to each other. Now, of course, you could do that using servlets, but we covered that in the first mini project. So you're not allowed to use servlets or standard HTTP methods to implement the core game functionality. So all of the messages that are passed to play the game have to be passed using, as I'll explain, using sockets, Java MI, and so on. However, if you want to use standard HTTP servlets to provide a graphical interface, or to administer the system, then that's fine. If you want to write a server that lets people, see a scoreboard or something like that using HTTP, that's absolutely fine. As long as the core game functionality is implemented using one of the specified technologies that is not HTTP. No marks for security either. I mean, obviously nice if you can do it, but no marks for it. There's extra marks for more complex, more innovative games, more complex game technology. So if instead of sockets, you decide to use JMS, Java Messaging Service, or WebSockets, then you can get more marks for that. There's extra marks for a graphical interface, and there's extra marks for streaming music or video. So you must implement the core game functionality using one of these technologies, or you won't get any marks for it, okay? So Java sockets is what I'm going to focus on in terms of the examples that I give you, in terms of the lectures I'm going to give you, mainly focusing on Java sockets, because I think it's the easiest way to implement the core game functionality. But there is also a lecture on Java Messaging Service, explaining how you can get that up and running, useful sort of enterprise technology. If you want to use that in your game, absolutely fine. Could be a good life skill. Or you're welcome to use Java RMI. Again, I'll give a lecture on that. Now, Java RMI is easier than Java Messaging Service, but it's a lot less used, so I'd probably recommend that less. Or WebSockets. So I'll give you a lecture. Again, there's a lecture on WebSockets explaining how you can implement it using NetBeans, Glassfish, except I haven't given you the stuff on the client. but we can have a conversation about, if you want to use WebSockets, I might let you use HTML and JavaScript on the front end, because WebSockets is kind of tricky. So have a conversation with me if you want to use WebSockets, but you have to use one of these 4 technologies. So as I said, there's lectures on all of these, and there'll be a lab session on JavaSockets, because I said that's the one I'm expecting you to use, but if you want to use a different one, I absolutely encourage it. You get some extra marks if you do use a different technology, and I can give you all the support for that in the lab sessions. So as I said, JMS and Java MI, kind of a bit of fiddling around, but the lecture kind of explains how you do that fiddling. I think they're doable, but JavaSockets are more straightforward to set up and use. So if you're not confident with Java and you're not desperate to learn or keen to learn new enterprise technologies, I just recommend you stick with sockets. But if you want to learn more, you want to get more marks, maybe you want to try one of the other methods for communicating. You're almost certainly going to have to use threads, particularly if you're using sockets. Threads are quite tricky, so there'll be a lecture and laboratory session on threads. Now, this is a group project in which the groups will be allocated at random. So what I'm going to do is going to take your marks from mini project 1, and I'm going to use those marks to allocate you into groups. So they'll be random, but they'll be mixed ability groups. So in the mixed ability groups of 2 people, there'll be someone who got a high mark from mini project 1 and someone who got a medium mark from mini project 1. And in groups of 3 people, there'll be someone who got a high mark from mini project 1, someone got a medium mark from mini project 1, and someone who got a low mark from mini project 1. These groups are absolutely and completely not negotiable. Okay? Now, there's a number of reasons why I'm using mixed ability groups. Perhaps there's a little history here, right? Perhaps I was always the child on the side, marginalized, left out and all that. So maybe, I don't like people being excluded because they don't have lots of mates and then they find it harder to get into particular groups. So there's maybe a little bit of a psychological, social dimension to this. But mainly, I think it's, so in the previous year, I did it with random groups, but without the mixed ability thing. And so by chance, you got some people who were like highly skilled and they all kind of clustered together just by chance. And some people were weren't so good. And, the people who weren't so good, they did terrible projects and they didn't learn anything from it. And they just were in this kind of morass of despair. And the people who are sort of highly skilled, well, yeah, sure, they did a good project, but they didn't necessarily learn that much because they were working together on something that actually isn't that difficult anyway. So it doesn't really work from a teaching point of view to work in groups where you have people who are who are struggling with the material all put together in the same group. On the other hand, if you put people in mixed ability groups, then you often find that people often find that they have different skills that they can bring to bear on the project, right? You might have people who are good at programming, other people who are better at writing reports, other people who are full of ideas but don't know how to put them into actual code. And so if you put these people together, they can often find ways in which they can complement each other's skills and work together as a team. So I saw many nice examples of that in the last year when I ran this course. And obviously not every group worked perfectly, but in general, it was a lot better than just having people trying to sort themselves out into groups, which generally leads to a bunch of skilled people working together and a bunch of people who are struggling with it working together. More importantly, random group allocation is very similar to a real work situation. A real work situation in which you're allocated to a team and you have to work with a team regardless of whether you like or dislike particular team members, right? So, at the end of this module, you're going out into the real world, getting a proper job. Maybe you get a job as a junior programmer or something, at IBM, let's suppose, or Microsoft, and they'll put you in a team with a bunch of people, and you will have to work with those people regardless of whether you like them, whether you think they're funny, whatever it is, right? You're going to have to write code with those people, and that will be your job. So by getting a little bit of practice with working in a team that is not of your choosing, that's going to help to prepare you for a real work situation, because pretty much every work situation is going to be like that. You're going to be allocated with a bunch of people, some of who are better than you, and some of who are worse than you. And you just got to make the best of the team and learn to work with teams, because that's the real world. And the real bonus from all of this random group allocation stuff as well is that if you're trying to get one of those jobs at IBM or Microsoft, then you're going to need to, there will be a question, almost certainly guarantee it, on your application form saying, tell us about your experience working in a team, right? So this is a perfect example, right? You can say, when I was at Middlesex, my cruel and heartless module leader for CCE 3110 put me in this random group, and I worked together with this team, and we had this bad stuff, and then we had some good stuff, and we produced a brilliant project, right? You can tell a story on your application form about how you were randomly allocated in a team and how you made it work, okay? Then when you've got the interview, Microsoft, IBM, whatever, and they say one of the questions, I guarantee you they will ask, particularly the sort of HR people always ask these questions. Give us an example of some teamwork you've done. So again, you can say, well, here I was, heartless module leader put me in this random group with people who are, not as skilled as myself, but then it turned out that the different people I was working with had these different abilities, and we managed to put together a project that was much better than I could have done by myself. That's what they want to hear when you have an interview for like a coding job or whatever. They want to know, can you work with other people? Because that's a key life skill that they're looking for. Finally, on all this random group allocation stuff, because I realize it's a little controversial, as I will explain later, your final individual mark from this project reflects what you've actually contributed to the project, and people who don't make any contribution to the project will actually get 0 marks. So if you're working with people who contribute less to the project and you're putting much more into the project, then you're going to get a higher mark. So you're not going to lose out, even if you're doing most of the work, you're actually going to get your mark boosted as a result of people not contributing. So all in all, it's wonderful, it's perfect. Random group allocation is the way to go, in my opinion. Right, so what we got support to help you with this mini project? Well, we got peer feedback on project proposals. I'll have a seminar on that or a lab session on that, I haven't decided yet. Then we'll have lab sessions on the core technologies that you'll probably be using, such as TCP sockets, TCP/IP sockets, threads, music streaming. We'll also have some lab sessions dedicated to the mini project. But bear in mind, there's 22 hours of labs this term. You're going to have to work on this in your own time, all right? I realize that there are many other demands on your time, but if you want to pass this module, if you want to get a reasonable mark for this project, you're not going to get it done in 22 hours, because those 22 hours also include learning the core technologies and getting some hands-on experience with them. So you're going to have to work on this in your own time. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the 2 submissions you have to make for this project. So first, we've got the interim submission. You have to submit that at the end of week 20. So I've made it the end of week 20 because I know you, because I've also given you these class presentations and the essays, right? So this kind of gives you a little bit of time after you've submitted your essay to work on this interim submission if you haven't completed it already. So in the interim submission, it's worth 25% the mark for the project. You have to submit a short report, a description of the game protocols, I'll explain what this means, and a spreadsheet with the contributions of group members. So these spreadsheets are how I work out your individual mark from your contributions and the group mark. So as usual, you always submit your work using links on the course website. If it's not working for some reason, UniHub's down, submit it to me by email. That's fine, but I'd much rather you submitted it using the links on the course website if it's available. So the interim submission has an interim report. That's worth 10% the mark. You should briefly describe the project and explain, how it's going, right? This is week 20. You will already have had, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, maybe 8 weeks, 16 hours working on this project. I'm expecting you to make some progress. I'm going to give you more marks if you've made more progress with your project. You can reuse all this material in the final report. I don't care about that. I'm going to give higher marks to projects making good progress. I also want, in this interim report, a description of the protocols that you're going to use in your game. So we're going to have an exercise on this in the seminar in the autumn term, where I'm going to get you to design some protocols for an online game, get some hands-on experience with designing protocols. Sometimes in exam, there's an exam question asking you to design protocols, because internet scale applications are all based on protocols, right? If you're doing a peer-to-peer network, a multimedia, massive multiplayer online game, Bitcoin, file sharing, whatever it is, you're basically designing different protocols to enable systems to work across the internet, or HTTP for that matter. So I want you to think deeply about in a more rigorous way about protocols. So I'm expecting you to design the protocols for the game, not sort of knock something off in a half-hearted way that you sort of hack your way through and somehow make half work. So I want you to think carefully about your protocols before you implement your game, and obviously that's going to make it easier to implement the game when you actually come to writing the code. So there's 10 marks for documenting the message types and the data that's sent in those messages, and 5 marks for a work-through example of a game played with your messages. Okay, so as I said, we're going to go through this in one of the seminars, but I'll say just very briefly what I mean by that. So this is taken from the seminar exercises. So if we're trying to play tic-tac-toe, I've got to be able to send a message to the other player or to the server in this case. Suppose we're playing tic-tac-toe with 2 players and a central server. We're going to have that kind of architecture. It's not a peer-to-peer architecture. It's like a server, and people are communicating through the server. So the players, when they connect to the server, need to sort of, first thing they need to do maybe is say, well, hey, I'm a player. I want to, join the pool of players so you can set me up with a game. Okay? So we might have something like an add player request message. And the data in this add player request will be the name of the player who wants to join the game, right? So the player will send an add player request message, and they'll receive back an acknowledgement message, maybe with the ID of the player, so that the player has an ID, and they can use that ID in subsequent messages. And then we might have something like a join game request message, including the player ID this time, and then the server might set this player up with another player, and then we'll have a reply with the ID of the opponent. And this is tic-tac-toe, right? So is it noughts or crosses? Is it the player's move? And there'll be a game ID as well, for example, let's say. So you have to sort of make up some stuff, make up some messages that will enable you to play, in this case tic-tac-toe, but you've obviously got to be able to play your game, either in a peer-to-peer way or through a central server. So these are the message types. You don't have to copy these message types. You have to make up your own. Oh yeah, so that's what I was going to say. So don't think in terms of code or anything like that with these. When you're thinking about this problem, think about a message that you could write down on a piece of paper and pass to someone, and then they could write down something on a bit of paper and pass back to you. You should be able to use these messages to play just using pieces of paper. Don't worry about writing code or any of that. That's why I've written it out in tables. You should be able to silently play the game by writing these kind of messages, but obviously these messages should be easily implemented in code. It shouldn't be like some complicated bit of natural language because the computer won't understand it. So these are the message types. I'm expecting you to give a short description of each of these message types, like the purpose of it, what the data is, and so on and so forth. And then a work-through example, this sort of initialization stage would be just the same messages, right, but with the data in as well. So then we'd have like an add player request, and then we'd have an add player acknowledgement, passing back. So this would say the player name here, and this would pass back like David 43 as my player ID. And then I say I want to join the game, and then I get back like my opponent's ID, Mary 11, let's say, sign noughts, move first, 87, whatever. And then you need to document the rest of the game, right? Once I've got the join game ack, then I can have like a add cross message or something like that, where I include the game ID maybe and the position and the X and Y position or something like that. So we'll go through this in the labs, or rather in the seminar. I can talk you through it in the labs, but this is roughly what I'm expecting for your 15 marks in your interim submission. Interim submission must also include the interim submission contribution spreadsheet. So that's the file name, and it'll be available on the mini project 2 section of the course website. So it looks like this, and I'll sort of give you a demo of it, but just to very briefly explain how it works. So we have this is for 3. If you've got 3 members of your group, in this case you've got Alice, Bob, and Carol. Now, so these pink areas are the areas that you can actually edit. You might be able to edit these as well, but most of the spreadsheet's locked, so you don't make mistakes and change it in a way that messes up your final mark. So what you do is you put your name here, and then you put the contribution that you've made to each of the tasks. So in the interim report, it's only got 3 tasks, right? You've got to write the report, you've got to design the game messages, and do a work-through example of the game messages. And then when I mark your project, I'm going to put some marks here. And you should put here each of these 3 numbers. These 3 numbers should all add up to 1, right? So if Alice wrote the interim report, Bob did the game messages, and Carol did the worked example, then you put 1 there, 1 there, 1 there. If you all worked on it equally, then you could put 0.33, 0.33, 0.33. This check here will come up with an error if these three numbers don't add up to 1, and it'll say not implemented if they add up to 0, and it'll say OK if they add up to 1. So what the spreadsheet will do, it will calculate how many marks Alice has contributed to the project, how many marks Bob has contributed to the project, and how many marks Carol has contributed to the project. And then this is the amount of the mark, and depending on the contributions, the spreadsheet will shift Alice, Bob's, and Carol's marks up or down depending on their contribution. And they'll do that by up to 33%. That's what the percentage mark change means here. So first it'll calculate the average contribution, and then it will use contribution formula, which I'll briefly explain, to boost people who do more than average work and cut people who do less than average work. And so it'll generate a final mark here, and I'll give you a little bit of demo like that. And this final mark will be an increased or decreased version of the mark that's awarded to the project. It's not like each person gets a third of the marks. They get the same, if they all do the same work, they'd all get the same mark, which would be the mark here. But if they're doing more or less work, then they're getting a mark pushed or cut, depending on their contribution. And if anyone does 0 work, then they get 0 marks. That's the absolute rule there. So the formula that the spreadsheet uses, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but you have like the individual, how much you've contributed, the final mark for the group, the average mark of the group members, and the final individual mark. So the final individual mark is like the group mark, and then boosted up or down depending on whether someone's done more or less contributions. Unless they've made 0 contributions, in which case they just get 0 marks. So the result is limited to the maximum number of marks. Obviously, Alice can't get a mark boosted up to 100 or something if there's only 25 marks available for the project. And there's only a factor of 33%, so it doesn't get boosted or cut by more than 33%. It seems like a rough, fairly reasonable sort of, it's worked in previous years, and I think this is about right. So I'll give you a little demo of the spreadsheet. Find it. Right, so that's the final one, don't want that. Right, so here we go. So here's the spreadsheet, the actual real spreadsheet. So if you're trying to edit a field that's locked, you won't be able to do it. So I can't change the percentage change or anything like that, just to prevent you from making changes that shouldn't be made anyway. So we've got two versions of the spreadsheet, depending on the size of the group. So let's just zoom out a little bit. So we've got a group size 2, if there's 2 members of the group, and a group size of 3, if you've got 3 members of the group. So first thing is you put your name in, so David, Alan, Susan, whatever. So you can see when we put the names in, then their names come up here, David, Alan, and Susan. Now, let's suppose the project, did pretty well. We got 8 marks, game messages, 7, whatever. Work through, for example, 4. So the interim submission gets like 19 out of 25 marks. Now, suppose I do the work on the interim report, Alan does the work on the game messages, and Susan did the work on the worked example of the game messages, yeah? So in that case, you can see we've got contribution checks okay, because each of these rows add up to 1. Now if the rows don't add up to 1, if I had like a 1 there as well, then we're getting an error, right? So in fact, let's game it a little bit. So we get 0.5. Whereas if, suppose Alan and Susan work together on the game messages, just an example, right? Then, so that's, so we enter the appropriate contributions. They almost add up to 1, because there's only one sort of, piece of work, if you like. Now, here we got Susan's contributed 2 marks to the project, Alan's contributed 9 marks to the project, and David's contributed 8 marks to the project. So now those contributions, mark contributions, are going to go into the contribution formula. So first we're going to work out the average contribution. So the average contribution in this case is like 6.33, whatever. And now that goes into the contribution formula so that David's mark, instead of being 19, which is the mark for the project, is being boosted up to 21. Alan, who did the most work, is getting his mark boosted up to 22. And then Susan, who did the least work, is getting her mark cut to 15. So these are all out of 25, these marks. So you can see that this tries to be, fair and tries to give a fair assessment of how much people have done for the project and make their mark reflect that to some extent. So let's just take another example. Suppose Susan's complete free rider, doesn't do any work at all. Okay, and suppose Alan, did both the game messages and whatever. So Susan just sort of sat around and didn't do anything at all. Now in this case, Susan doesn't get her mark cut by 33%, she just gets nothing. So if you do nothing, you get nothing. That's how this group project works. But in this case, Alan's got even more, boosting of his mark, right? So even though the final project mark is still 19, Alan's, instead of getting 22, is getting 24 because he's had to do the extra work on working through the example of the game messages. So this, as I said, so both David and Alan in this case are getting they're getting more marks than the project itself got because, they had to do more of the work by themselves. Whereas if everyone did equal marks, so I'll just give you a final example. 3, 3, so a minute. Can I copy that, I wonder? Yeah. Now, in this case, we're getting error, 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 but let's not worry too much about that because I can see when I look at this, because you're going to submit this, I'm going to look at it, I can see that these are all even. So in this case, everyone's contributed 6.27 marks, and everyone's got 19 as the final mark, which matches the mark here. Okay, so if you all do the same, that's great. I'm all for people working equally on a project. This contribution spreadsheet is to handle situations in which people don't bother turning up to the labs and don't do anything for the project. So if you're all working really well together, you can all give yourselves the same contributions and you'll get the same mark for the project. It's only for handling cases where people don't work well together. Okay. Right, so that's the interim submission, which is the end of week 20. Now I'm going to talk about the final submission. 75% of the mark, you submit a zip file containing the code, submit a final report, and again, the final submission spreadsheet with the contributions to the group members. And this is the end of week 23. So final report, you have to include the instructions of playing the game. If you've made up some game from scratch, please describe it because I won't understand it. If it's like Connect 4 or chess, you don't need to describe it in detail, just explain that it's Connect 4 or chess. I want to know what technology you've used, communication. I'm going to look at your code, but it's easier, if I understand, if you describe and explain that. Just a general point, I'm asking you to design your protocols for the game by week 20, but you're welcome to change and adjust them if you need to when you're producing the final version. You won't be penalized for that. And I want some screenshots of the gameplay on the console, if it's a console-based game, if you're just typing in the command line or whatever, or if it's a graphical interface, please include some screenshots of the graphical interface. Your final submission must include the final contribution spreadsheet. This will be a separate submission tab on the submission where you submit it online. And that's the spreadsheet there, available on the course website. So this works in exactly the same way as the spreadsheet that I've just explained. So you have, except here, here are all the features that you can get marks for. The marks are available. When I mark your project, I'll put the marks in here. And in exactly the same way, put your contributions here. It'll calculate the contributed marks, calculate the average marks, and work out a final marks. I don't think I really need to go through that in detail because it's exactly the same spreadsheet, just with different stuff on it. So in the past, there have been problems where group members don't bother turning up to meetings, they can't be reached by email, and they're not really doing anything for the project. So if one of your group members doesn't bother turning up to anything, maybe talk to me initially. I'll try and sort it out in the labs. I'll talk to the person, do my best to resolve the group tensions, because these things do happen. Can't be helped. That's part of the working with groups, has good things and bad things, right? But it's really important, if you are organizing group meetings and inviting all the team members along, to keep a record of that. And make sure you keep a record of the emails you've sent to each other. Because what I don't want is a situation where we have the final demo of the project and, there's Alice, Bob, and Carol. And Bob says, well, you never invited me to the group meetings. You just left me out. You didn't give me a chance to contribute. So that's the situation I really want to avoid, because I don't mind giving Bob 0 contribution if Bob didn't show up to anything and did no work. That's absolutely fine. But if Bob was excluded from the group by the other group members, then that's a different matter entirely, and I'm completely not willing to give Bob 0 contribution in that case. I'll fix the contribution so that Bob gets a fair mark as well. So the best thing to do if you're having problems with group dynamics is to get in touch, because the sooner I know about them, the sooner I can try and fix them, and then then I'll be perfectly open to giving Bob the 0 contribution. If you invited into the meetings, he's going to bother to turn up. But I really want to avoid exclusion, so it's really important you talk to me as soon as possible if you are having this kind of problems, and keep document your attempts to include all of the group members. Right, so assessment. So to assess your mini project 2s, I will read the project report, I will read the code carefully, and I will view a short demonstration of your game during laboratory sessions after the submission date. As I said, I'm going to mark it out of 100, the project as a whole, 75-25 for the 2 submissions, and I'm going to use once I've got them, for each of the submissions, I will use the contribution spreadsheets to calculate individual marks from the group marks, as I've explained. And your final individual mark will be scaled down to a mark between 0 and 20 that corresponds to 20% of the overall mark for the module. Now, it's absolutely mandatory, if you want to get a mark for this project, that you demonstrate your project, okay? Yep. So you're going to submit this on week 23. There'll be a laboratory session on week 24. You must demonstrate your project to me during that laboratory session. First thing, don't sort of submit the project on the Friday of week 23 and then work on it over the weekend until it's all sparkling and wonderful for the following week. Because I'm going to look at the submitted code. And I'm going to make sure that the submitted code is the code that you demonstrate. I don't mind if it's got a few bugs, okay? I understand you're going to have a few bugs, and your demo might be a little bit rigged. To avoid those bugs, that's fine. I can live with that. But what I don't want you to do is work on the code after you've submitted it, okay? That's completely out. So there will be a final demonstration deadline, but please aim to demonstrate it in week 24, because it's going to be, it's typically a bit of a nightmare trying to sort out demos with 3 group members, with everyone doing this and that after the end of week 24. When the teaching's over, it's much harder to arrange a demo. So please aim to do the demo in the lab session in week 24. But if for some reason one of your group members is ill or something, the final deadline for demonstration will be early May, and I'll set that deadline each year for the final demonstration deadline. Now, I'm expecting you all to turn up at the demo so I can ask you about your contributions and make sure that you all did what you said you did. If you can't be bothered to turn up to the demonstration without letting the other group members and myself know, if you just don't turn up, you lose your right to contest the contribution that's been allocated to them. So if Bob is allocated 0 contribution in the contribution spreadsheet and Bob doesn't bother turning up to the demo, then Bob loses his right to contest that 0 contribution. On the other hand, if Bob turns up to the meeting, to the demonstration, then we can have a discussion with Bob and the other group members about why he didn't turn up or what he did and what he claims to have done and so on and so forth. That's the point, part of the point of the demonstration. So the demonstration, yeah, it's got the one point is to, make sure everyone's happy with the contributions that they claim to have made. Second point is so I can see your project running. I'm not going to run your projects myself. I want to see them running, and you can demonstrate them running across multiple computers. And third, I can then give you some feedback about your projects in person, saying, well, good job, jolly good show and all that. Or I might say, well, maybe you could fix this, and maybe you could improve this, and maybe you could have done this instead, and we can have a proper conversation about your projects. So I will not mark your final submission. You will not get a mark for your final submission unless it's been demonstrated. It's a mandatory part of the assessment of this project. So, assuming you've demonstrated, I will mark the project using the assessment criteria included with the project description. So, download the project description. At the end of that, there are the assessment criteria. I strongly recommend you read them, okay? And I strongly recommend you mark your project before submitting it using these criteria, because you might have forgotten something like code quality or whatever, and then this will remind you, and then you can go back to your project, fix it, and get more marks, okay? That's part of the point of that. So here are the criteria. Now, the first thing to note is, as I said, these lectures, this video might be used on subsequent years. So in the assessment criteria, they're the exact dates for when each piece of functionality has to be submitted. But I'm just putting and these within the project description on the course website, these dates will be accurate. But this date's obviously, if you're watching this in 2020 or the year 3000 or whatever, these dates aren't going to be accurate. So instead, just think in terms of weeks, for the purposes of this lecture. So the first part of the assessment criteria is the interim report. And this should be submitted with the protocols at the end of week 20. So it's just a short report. I just want a brief description of the project. What are you doing? That kind of stuff. What kind of game is it? How do you play it? Is it going to be central server, peer-to-peer, whatever? I want to know how the project's going. As I said, I'm going to give higher marks if you're actually cracking on with your project by the end of week 20. And if you include the contribution spreadsheet, I'll give you an extra 2 marks, just to remind you, really. And as I said, I want you to design the protocols for your online game. You can change the protocols later, but I'm obviously not going to remark the protocols in week 23. You've got to design the protocols here, and I'll give you the marks for them at the end of week 20. So describe the messages, 10 marks for that. Complete set of messages that will enable the game to be played between 2 computers, but also by writing the messages on pieces of paper. Think in terms of pieces of paper for this stage of the project. And then a work, for example, of the game played with your proposed messages. Again, pieces of paper. That's how you should think about doing it. Then we've got the game functionality. So we've got 10 marks for a basic game that can be played between 2 computers. No marks for a tic-tac-toe implementation. It's got to be a different game from tic-tac-toe. And then I've got this sort of slightly loose category of 25 marks for the complexity of the game, the complexity of the implementation, like multiple games, game administration, scoreboards, etc. The complexity of the technology, so if you use JMS instead of TCP, IP, and the extent to which the game goes beyond the examples I've given you. So I'm giving you some pretty detailed examples of tic-tac-toe. That's another reason why I'm not letting you do tic-tac-toe. So I'm expecting you to, if you show some initiative and produce a really cracking game, then I can give you 25 marks for complexity, right? So that's kind of what the marks are for. So, but if you get any old sort of lousy quiz game or something working, you're going to get 10 marks. I'm not going to be fussy about giving you those 10 marks as long as you write some game yourself and it basically works. These are for putting some extra effort into your project. So you must implement the game using the specified technology. You can only use HTTP for visualize it for graphical interface, or possibly for WebSockets. I might be flexible about WebSockets, but talk to me first about that. Yeah, 0 marks tic-tac-toe implementation. Then there's some marks for a graphical interface. So as I said, you can run that using, you can produce a kind of web-based interface to your game, that's fine, using HTTP. Or you can use JavaFX, would be an obvious choice. You could possibly even write an app if you wanted to write an app. I'd consider that an app communicating with sockets in JavaFX. Talk to me about that if you want to do that. So you get 10 marks of graphical interface, and then there's a lecture on music streaming. I'll give you some example code for that, which you're welcome to use for this. You're welcome to adapt the example code and get it all working, or you're welcome to write your own music streaming, right, based upon the example I've given you, or you can stream using UDP, whatever you like. Now, this is something you must not forget, because it's worth 10 marks. I'm expecting, there's 10 marks for code quality. Just spend a bit of time making your code look attractive, right? It's not that hard. And it'll help you write better code. So 5 marks for comments, 5 marks for layout and organization. Okay, so separate things nicely into separate classes. Each method and each class should have a comment, explain any core bits of functionality. It'll help you write better code. It's the sort of thing you have to do whenever you work in a team and collaborate on code in the real world. So just, get it right, do it. And then project reports. So brief description of the project. If you failed miserably to do certain things, maybe document that in the report. Just be honest about it, right? It's going to be obvious what works and doesn't work. You're going to do a demo. I'm going to look at your code. You can't hide stuff. So it's better to be upfront and explain what worked well and what didn't work well. The most important thing is accuracy, as I said. If you make claims about how, amazing, how this is, some kind of super mega massive multiplayer online game part 2 or whatever, be accurate. I'll mark you down if you're not accurate. I need some screenshots of the gameplay on the console or graphical interface. Please, in any of these reports, do not include screenshots of NetBeans or code, all right? NetBeans is a fascinating thing to look at, I realize, but I really don't need screenshots of NetBeans in your report. I know what NetBeans looks like, and I know what the code looks like because you submitted the code separately. So just focus on describing and documenting, the actual gameplay on the console or on the graphical interface. And again, this is just really a reminder, make sure you include the contribution spreadsheet. So, now back onto sort of more general administrative matters, if you like. Now, as you're studying on this course, you may get ill, you may have personal problems, serious financial issues. You might have family members who are ill or, pass away. And Middlesex has a deferral of assessment mechanism to handle these kinds of situations. So you can apply for a deferral of assessment. If you're granted a deferral of assessment, you get extra time to complete coursework, or you can retake an exam without a mark penalty. The key thing about deferral of assessment is you have to provide documentary evidence. So there's a whole procedure there. You fill in a form, you provide documentary evidence, doctor's certificate, whatever it is. And then they look at that documentary evidence and they'll grant you a deferral of assessment if they think it's valid. And then there'll be a mark on your sort of, university record or whatever, which I can see, and so I can double check that you actually have a deferral of assessment. So if you're having serious problems of any of this kind, either just talk to UniHelp or come and see me. I'll sort of point you in this direction towards the deferral of assessment. If you're granted a deferral of assessment, please tell me about that, because there's no mechanism whereby the university notifies me about students with deferrals of assessment. Sadly, they should, right? But they don't. So if you're having serious problems, I recommend strongly that you go with this route, which gives you extra time to complete coursework and it doesn't affect your grade or anything like that. On the other hand, if I'm very unlikely to give extensions to coursework to students without a deferral of assessment. So the way to go if you're having real problems is to go with a deferral of assessment, because I don't accept excuses, okay? Because I don't have the ability to, look at doctor's certificates or, other documentary evidence about people's problems, or even probably the authority to ask for these kind of things, okay? So if you just come to me and say, my grandfather's been unwell or something, what I'm going to do is say, go for the deferral of assessment mechanism. I'm not, that's what it's there for, right? But if you come to me and say, well, I've been sleeping a lot lately and I didn't manage to do any of my coursework, then I'll just say, forget it. I will also say, forget it if you, tell me you've lost your USB stick or your laptop hard drive's fried. Your third-year students, take responsibility for backing up your data. You've got OneDrive to do that. You can email it to yourself. I do not accept excuses about lost data, about crashed hard drives, about lost laptops, because your data should be copied after every session, either to the cloud or by emailing it to yourself or whatever. So excuses don't wash, sorry, but they don't. So I strongly recommend you hand your coursework in time, plan ahead, saying, oh, I was too busy. You just lose the marks, possibly fail. It's your choice, okay? So if you are running into problems, I'm more than happy to have a conversation about that with you. Come and see me, make an appointment in come and see me in my office, or talk to me in the lab or the seminars. Happy to try and help you with this, but it's not really acceptable just to come up to me on the Thursday before the deadline and say, oh, I just haven't done it, or I forgot, or I was having a nice holiday and I decided not to bother. It's not good enough, okay? So unless I've given you permission for late submission, the marks available for coursework will halve every 24 hours after the deadline and will be 0 after 1 week. So the time I'm recording this, the deadlines are at 5 p.m. on Fridays, right, at the end of the specified week. So at 5 p.m. on Saturday, after that 24 hours after the deadline, the mark available will halve, and I will enforce that. And then 24 hours after that, the mark available will halve and halve and halve, until after 1 week, there'll be 0 marks available. So if you're late, more than 24 hours late, you're going to lose half your marks, and so on and so forth, and that will be enforced. I'm sure you've been lectured many times about plagiarism. I'm just going to mention it here. It's a serious academic offence. If you submit identical project to someone else, both students will be reported to the university, and if you're found guilty, you have to resubmit your work. Your mark will be capped, or you could fail the module. So there's, don't need to say a lot about that, I don't think, but just don't do it. And also, I'm not, going to make detailed investigations. I'm not going to check, who copied what off who, and do some kind of digital forensics or whatever. If 2 projects are identical, both people will be reported, or both groups will be reported in the case of this project. So make sure that you don't just give your project to, to your mate who copies it and submits it, because both people will be responsible for that plagiarism. I have had issues, particularly in this module, of people who kind of collaborate on a single project and then they submit as their own work with minor differences. It's very obvious when people do this, okay? In general, I'm all for collaboration, right? I'm all for people helping each other solve problems, apply solutions to their own projects. I strongly encourage collaboration, students help each other. That's why we've got the random groups, right? but it's not acceptable to collaborate on a single project which is submitted as individual work or individual group work in this case. So if two groups work together on a single game, and then one calls it, Connect 4, and one calls it, 4 Connect or something, and they change the graphics a little bit, and basically it's the same code, then I'm going to divide the marks between the groups that submit that project. So if two groups collaborate on a single project and submit it separately, each group will get, and so 3 groups, suppose, submit almost identical projects. I'm going to divide the marks between the groups, so each group will get 20% instead of 60%, and this applies to the marks for the parts of the project that are identical. So, you've got to help each other, but don't produce work on a single project that you submit as separate projects. Okay, so all that sort of heavy stuff out of the way. Let's have a look at some examples. So this is from the first year around this module. To be frank, I don't actually know what it does, but I think there's some way in which you sort of click on the points and you've got to sort of work your way towards the other team. But anyway, I was quite impressed by it, and it was a nice bit of code, and it got a high mark. So Connect 4, this is a great project from last year. You're dropping the things and taking turns to drop the counters and Connect 4, whatever. So this is a really good project. There's another really good project, so some kind of turn-based shooter brain. There's some kind of worms with guns, and they have to shoot each other. I never really understood it, but, it looked cool. And this is another really nice shooter game. So in this case, you've got the keyboard handling event stuff, and you sort of shoot your bullets, and the bullets are all streamed to the UDP to the other computers, and then you sort of move your player around, and you've got the health bars and stuff like that. So I thought this was a really nice game. So this is the screenshot of each player sees their own screenshot and moves their own player around to try and shoot the other one with the bullets. In general, you're more than welcome to look around the internet for game ideas. Of course, it's great to look at game ideas. It's great to look at other code to see how other things are implemented. But you will be severely penalized for code that's copied with little or modification from another source. So don't just go online, copy snakes and ladders, and say, hey ho, here's my wonderful online snakes and ladders. Can you give me 100 marks, please? It's generally very obvious when someone copies a bunch of code that they only half understand and submit as their own work. I'm going to be seeing you working on your project throughout the spring term, okay? So if you just suddenly at the end of week 10 come up with a miraculously perfect project, I'm going to be extremely suspicious. I'm going to spend a lot of time looking for examples of the kind of project that you've submitted, and I'll probably find it, okay? Not 100%, but I'll probably find it. And I will only give you credit for the code that you've written, not for code you've copied. Okay, that's my rule. So I don't mind you adapting a game, but then you just bear in mind if you adapt a game that I'm only going to give you credit for the adaptation, not for the whole thing. Okay, so and I'm going to check this really carefully. Okay, because by the end of the spring term, I'm going to have a pretty good idea about how good you are at writing Java, and if you're lousy, if you're struggling with your Java and yet you're handing in this amazing 20 class game that works across 1,000 computers, I'm going to get pretty suspicious, okay? So I recommend that you work, we're there to help you write a good project, right? Work with us. We can work together to get a good project written. Don't just copy something off the internet and submit it as your own work, okay? Because you won't work. You're very unlikely to get lots of marks if you take that approach. You'll get a better mark if you just work on a simpler game and try and write it yourself. Okay. So, document describing mini project 2 in details available on the course website. So I recommend you read that. When you start on your project, read that document. I'll point you to that in the lab sessions as well. It's got all the assessment criteria that I mentioned. I'll go through all this in a seminar. You have a chance to ask questions, and hopefully it'll be really clear what I'm expecting you to do. So this lecture described mini project 2, how it'll be assessed. And next lecture is going to cover sockets, which might be the technology that you choose to use for this mini project.